The splendid setting of the Honourable Artillery Company in the heart of the City of London was a fitting stage for John Smit's farewell performance. The most capped player in the history of South African rugby, Smit is returning home to become chief executive of the Sharks, the club he served with such distinction for 13 years.
It is pretty surreal. I never, you never think about when it'll end when you're starting out. You just wonder how long it'll last and what's coming next. And 16 years ago, I started as a professional, and I think I've been blessed to be able to play for so long and play with amazing players and for great teams as well. So it's it was falling out in the semi-final of both the Heineken Cup and the Premiership was disappointing. And you never know when your last game is when you enter playoff rugby. But tonight's pretty special. You get to run out for the last time wearing the captain's sleeve and having a run out, for a pretty social game as well, and having a chance to literally, push the end button and start again somewhere else.
Smit has achieved virtually everything there is to win in the game, but as a youngster growing up in South Africa, rugby wasn't his first love.
My brothers played rugby, my father played rugby, and I was brought up in what was pretty much known as the East Rand, which is sort of the Johannesburg, Boksburg area, and we were stationed right next door to a tennis club, and that's all I wanted to do. So I went and hit the ball against the wall for hours on end until my mother would shout and make me do my homework. And I did visions of grandeur, serving aces at Wimbledon one day. I used to love Ivan Lendl, and he used to cry every time he lost in the final of Wimbledon, which happened quite regularly in those days. And it was all I really did, and I never really had been exposed to team sports or rugby for that matter. We moved to a more rural town of Rustenburg, and by that stage I'd already started getting a little bit bigger than my own peers. The serve and volley was starting to become less effective as well, and I was possibly more suited towards the front row of a rugby team. I would love to sit here and say if only I'd stuck with tennis, but something tells me at 120 kilos I probably wouldn't have had too many Wimbledon titles under my belt.
Once it became apparent a living from tennis was never going to happen, rugby took over. The majority of his 111 caps came as hooker, but it was elsewhere in the front row where his career first took off.
Well, I played tight end from day one, and pretty much how that worked out is the first day, I think I was 11 years old, which is quite late for a South African boy to start playing rugby. You normally start around 4 or 5 years old. And they did, tallest to shortest and fattest to thinnest. And so I stood in the front of the fat guys and they said, okay, well, you've got prop written all over you. So I started off as a prop and stayed that way. From the age of 11, I played prop all the way through to the age of 22. The reason why I think it came about that tight end was all I played until 2001. Was purely because Jake White came to me and said, John, there's not really a lot of hookers around. There are a lot of props. You probably will be a Springbok one day if you stick at it, but you could very much be a Springbok hooker, quite soon if you learned how to throw and try to adjust your game. And so the sign of that to a 22-year-old was, well, where do I start? So I started throwing balls and learned how to play hooker and only played my first provincial game at hooker at the age of 22. Played for the Springboks 4 months later as a hooker.
Nick Mallett awarded a first cap to Smit against Canada 13 years ago, and by the 2003 Rugby World Cup in Australia, he was his country's first choice hooker, but it proved to be a humbling experience.
It was in vast contrast to 2007, but I didn't know what to compare it to. I think in defense of how poorly we performed and how badly we did and how early we exited the tournament, I think we possibly didn't have the best of players to choose from, which we normally do have an abundance of talent. And if you go through the squad that made it to Australia, there were some okay players and there were some great players, but they were all 19, 20 years old, and the likes of Skalkberger, Jacques Fourie, etc. So it was, I suppose, the core of what was to come, but it was nowhere near ready for that kind of a challenge. I think at that stage, the ambition of those players was to get to a World Cup, was to play in a World Cup. and not to win a World Cup. And that, I suppose, is, therein lies a lot of how poorly we did, and such a huge amount of negativity around our preparation with Kampstaldraad, and it's just a massively bad time for Springbok rugby, probably at an all-time low when Jake did come in and asked me to be captain of the next era, which was daunting in itself. He sat me down and I just said, as long as you can promise it'll be better than this and better than what it's been. And he did make a promise, and he certainly stood up to it.
Later in the show, we'll talk more with John about captaincy and World Cup success.
A year after South Africa's disastrous showing at the 2003 World Cup, Rudy Strowley had gone and was replaced by Jake White. One of his first moves was to appoint a new captain, someone who would reunite a dispirited Springbok squad, and John Smit was that man.
I think the interesting thing about being a South African captain, and probably why it's been the most educating responsibility that I've been given in my short time on this planet so far, is that I had the view of, I'm not massively experienced leadership-wise. I've been under a lot of leaders, and I do have a reasonably complex team to lead. So I decided to purely focus on people and how we could bring them together. And I always tell a story about a guy who came into my change room and into my room on tour, and he just, he played for the Springboks and he was a high-profile player, but he was sitting on the bench and he wasn't getting game time, and he just said, you know what, I'm training harder than everybody, I'm making more tackles per minute, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, what more must I do to get selected in the starting lineup? And I just said, look, it's very hard for me. Thankfully, I don't select teams, but all I can say is if you stopped talking and asking questions about and focused more on the you probably find that not before long you'll be back in the team. I said, can you tell me Odwa's fiance's name? Can you tell me how many kids the coach has got? Can you tell me who likes golf? Anything. Can you tell me anything about anybody in the team? And he didn't quite know how to respond. He probably didn't know any of the answers either. And what I try to push with all the players from an early age was, let us invest in a little bit of time and effort into each other off the pitch. And when we did that, and we started to create a South African culture within a Springbok team, and that allowed us to be defending our line 5 meters out, and care about not letting the guy down next to us.
Between October 2003 and June 2007, Smit played a record 46 consecutive Test matches. Injury in South Africa's first match of the 2007 Tri-Nations brought that run to an end, but he recovered in time to lead South Africa to the World Cup. As they had been 4 years earlier, the Boks were drawn against England in the pool stages.
To be perfectly honest, we were in a very, very good space. That 36-0 was a bad time to play South Africa, and England were in a terrible space. I think they were on their third or fourth choice fly half. They had massive injury problems, and they possibly didn't have a massive amount of harmony with the coach. So 36-0 was a great place. We hadn't even contemplated what might come in quarterfinals, semi-finals, and finals. And after that day, to think that we would see England in a final wouldn't have been on any of our minds.
But just 5 weeks later, the same two sides met again with rugby's greatest prize at stake.
Walking out, there was no one shouting and screaming and headbutting walls and trying to get themselves. It was the ultimate moment for every single guy in that room. And walking out was there was a feeling of calmness and resolve about what we needed to do, and we knew what we needed to do. We had the detail, and standing there was just it was just that last calm moment of just before the battle begins.
And despite England's much improved performance, South Africa were worthy champions.
I still remember being thankful I didn't have to speak, because I was I'd welled up with tears, and the emotion was massive. And you see, the thing is, I was the lucky guy to hold it up, but it had taken so many people over a 4-year period to sacrifice so much. It was a very enjoyable day.
Over the next 4 years, Smit continued to lead his country with distinction, including a series win over the Lions and Tri-Nations success in 2009. But in 2011, he retired from international rugby. Last week, he finally called time on a remarkable career.
Everything that I have today, I've got out of rugby, because I've learnt my lessons, both good and bad, from the people that I've played with. I've played with, with guys who are legends in their own right, and I've learnt a huge amount from them. I've learnt how to deal with our diverse culture in a unique way, where we need each other as South Africans of different backgrounds. And I think any kind of success, if I do have it, from now on, will be because of what I learnt and what I was given out of rugby.